Behind the official reports of victories and defeats in the Great Patriotic War lies one of the darkest chapters in our history. The control machine created by the NKVD to strengthen discipline in the Red Army turned into a conveyor belt of death for hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers and officers, barrier troops, political officers, penal battalions, military tribunals. All these instruments were directed not against the external enemy, but against their own army. Today, we will tell the truth about how fear became a weapon and suspicion became the norm, about how a system designed to protect the motherland devoured its defenders. This is the story of a war within a war, where the front line ran not only between the trenches, but also in the souls of people forced to choose between conscience and survival. At dawn on June 22, 1941, the silence over the western borders of the Soviet Union was shattered by the roar of artillery and the screech of dive bombers. The Great Patriotic War had begun, an event that became not only the greatest test for the peoples of the USSR, but also a catalyst for the creation of a machine of total control within the army that was unprecedented in its cruelty and efficiency. To understand why extraordinary measures, including summary executions and blocking detachments, were necessary in the first weeks of the war, we need to go back a few years to the atmosphere that prevailed in the Red Army before that fateful day. By the summer of 1941, the workers' and peasants' Red Army was bloodied and disoriented. The reason for this was the Great Terror of 1937 to 1938, a wave of repression that swept through the senior and middle ranks of the command. The most experienced and talented military leaders, the cream of Soviet military thought, were arrested and shot on charges of military fascist conspiracy. Marshal Mikhail Tukhachevsky, Commanders Ion Yakir and Yeronim Uborovich, and many others. Of the 5 marshals of the Soviet Union, only 2 remained alive: Kliment Voroshilov and Semyon Budyonny, whose military talents, as the war showed, were quite modest. In just a few years, the army lost tens of thousands of commanders, from corps and division commanders to regimental commanders. They were replaced by young, inexperienced men who often had neither academic military education nor, more importantly, practical experience in commanding large military units. Fear of showing initiative and fear of being branded an enemy of the people for any mistake paralyzed their actions. The system was structured in such a way that loyalty was valued above competence. The second key element that determined the atmosphere in the army was the institution of military commissars, or politruks. Introduced during the Civil War, it was abolished and then reinstated. By the beginning of the war, the commissar was a figure equal to the commander. This created a system of dual power. Any order from the commander came into force only after it was signed by the commissar. On the one hand, political commissars were supposed to carry out political and educational work, raise morale, and explain party policy. On the other hand, they were the eyes of the sovereign in the army, exercising total control over the command staff. Any suspicion of disloyalty, any careless word could cost a commander his career or even his life. This system bred mistrust and hindered the operational management of the troops. And so this weakened, intimidated, and constrained army faced the Wehrmacht, the most powerful and experienced military machine of the time. The result of the first days was catastrophic. Communication between headquarters and units was disrupted. German aircraft dominated the skies, and entire armies and fronts were surrounded. Chaos broke out in the troops. Soldiers and junior commanders, left without leadership and unable to understand the situation, surrendered en masse or retreated in disorder to the east. The old methods of control and maintaining discipline proved completely powerless in the face of a military disaster of this magnitude. It became clear that new, extraordinary, and extremely harsh measures were needed to prevent the complete collapse of the front. It was in this atmosphere of total crisis that the NKVD came onto the scene, given virtually unlimited powers to restore order. An order based on fear, following the chaos of the first days of the war, when the front was cracking at the seams and collapsing. The state apparatus responded in the only way it knew how, with increased repression and total control. The main instrument of this policy in the active army was the NKVD's special departments. Formally created to combat espionage, sabotage, and treason, their functions were in fact much broader and more sinister. A special department was attached to each army and front, and its representatives, operatives, were present in every regiment and division. It was a parallel power structure, an invisible front that waged its war not so much against German intelligence as against its own soldiers and commanders. The main task of the Osobists, as they were called in the troops, was to fight the counter-revolution, which could mean anything from defeatist sentiments and criticism of the command to a careless joke. The Osobist were given extraordinary powers, including the right to arrest any military personnel, up to and including division commanders, and to conduct investigations using any methods. But their most powerful force was their extensive network of secret informers, or sexoti. Recruitment of agents was widespread. Operatives found ways to approach soldiers and officers using various methods. Some were intimidated, some were offered privileges, and some were persuaded that it was their patriotic duty to inform on their comrades. As a result, in every company and every headquarters, there were people who listened carefully, observed, and reported everything to their NKVD supervisor. This system created an atmosphere of universal fear and suspicion. Commanders feared their subordinates, and soldiers feared each other. Anyone could turn out to be an informer. In the first months of the war, the special departments launched a large-scale repressive campaign. On June 27, 1941, a directive was issued giving military tribunals the right to hear cases under a simplified procedure, without the participation of the defense and with the possibility of immediate execution of the sentence. Arrests and executions of panic-mongers, cowards, and deserters began. Often, sentences were handed down without any investigation, right on the front lines, to intimidate the rest. Show executions in front of the troops became one of the methods of restoring discipline. Special department employees not only identified enemies of the people, but also monitored the execution of orders, controlled the loyalty of the command staff, and, in essence, were the eyes and ears of the country's top political leadership in NKVD. The troops, they became the backbone of a system that sought to replace collapsed discipline with fear of imminent reprisals. It was an invisible but no less brutal front within the vast, bloody front of the Great Patriotic War. If the special departments were the secret backbone of control, then the institution of military commissars became its visible official face. After the catastrophic defeats of the summer of 1941, the Supreme Command Headquarters came to the conclusion that one of the reasons for the failures was the lack of firm political will in the troops. The decision was to return to the tried and tested model of the Civil War. On July 16, 1941, by decree of the Presidium of the Supreme Soviet of the USSR, the institution of military commissars was reintroduced in full in the Red Army. This meant the end of single command and a return to a system of dual power. From that moment on, orders from the commander of a regiment, division, or army were not valid without the signature of the commissar. Thus, The political commissar was assigned a dual and extremely contradictory function. On the one hand, he was an ideological worker, the soul of the unit. His duties included conducting political briefings, reading reports from the Sovinform Bureau, publishing combat leaflets, and, most importantly, setting a personal example. The propaganda image of the commissar was that of a fearless warrior with a pistol in his hand, leading soldiers into battle with the cry, "Communists, forward! For the motherland! For Stalin!" And it must be admitted that this image was not entirely fictional. History has preserved many examples of genuine heroism on the part of political officers. The most famous is the feat of junior political officer Alexei Yeremenko, captured in the famous photograph Combatant. Moments before his death, he replaced his wounded company commander and led the soldiers in a counterattack. People like him, with their courage and self-sacrifice, truly inspired the soldiers and strengthened their fighting spirit in the most desperate moments. But there was another, darker side to their activities. The commissar was the chief supervisor of the command staff. He assessed not only the combat qualities of the commander, but also his political reliability. Any retreat, any failure could be interpreted by the commissar as cowardice, panic, or even treason. The fate of an officer depended directly on his report to the higher-ups. This system gave rise to hidden conflicts. Experienced career military personnel often looked down on political officers, considering them amateurs in military affairs who interfered with the command of troops. Political officers, in turn, suspected commanders of military specialist sentiments and potential disloyalty. Thus, the commissar was both the glue that held together units disintegrating under enemy blows and a wedge driven between the commander and his soldiers. He could be a hero leading his men into battle, or he could be an executioner signing the death warrant of his comrade in arms. This duality was the tragedy and complexity of the political commissar in the Great Patriotic War. The word Zagradotriad became one of the darkest and most controversial symbols of that war. In the popular imagination, largely thanks to post-Soviet cinema, the image of ruthless NKVD officers shooting their own retreating soldiers in the back with machine guns has become entrenched. However, the real history of the Zagradotriadi is much more complex and ambiguous, and it began long before Stalin's famous order. The first rearguard units appeared in the first weeks of the war, in the summer and fall of 1941. Their creation was a spontaneous reaction by the command to the catastrophic situation at the front. When entire regiments and divisions, having lost control and communication, fled their positions in panic, it was necessary to stop this flow somehow. Army and front commanders, on their own initiative, began to form special barriers on roads, bridges, and in the rear of combat formations from the most reliable fighters and personnel of special units. Their main task was not to shoot, but to stop those who were fleeing, form new units from them, and return them to the front. It is important to understand the difference between the two types of such formations. There were NKVD troops guarding the rear of the active army. They were engaged in fighting saboteurs, guarding communications and headquarters, but also performed blocking functions, catching deserters and panic mongers in the deep rear. There were also army blocking detachments, formed from ordinary Red Army soldiers on the orders of the military command. They were stationed directly behind the fighting units. The directive of the Supreme Command Headquarters, dated September 12, 1941, signed by Stalin, officially ordered the creation of such units in every division for the first time. It stated, "Create a blocking unit in every rifle division from reliable fighters who will not allow units to retreat without permission." At the same time, The use of weapons was stipulated as a last resort. The main emphasis was on detention, filtration, and return to the ranks. Of course, the reality was brutal. In conditions of panic and chaos, weapons were used. There are documentary evidence and reports of shootings of malicious panic mongers and cowards on the spot, in front of the ranks, as a deterrent. But this was not a widespread practice, and there was certainly no machine gunning of one's own troops going into battle. That would have been not only inhumane, but also impractical. The army was already short of men. The main task was to get soldiers back into battle, not kill them. Thus, by the summer of 1942, the barrier troops system already existed and was operational, but it was more a tool for maintaining order in the immediate rear than a punitive sword aimed at the back of its own army. Everything changed after the order that went down in history as number 227. The summer of 1942 was perhaps the darkest period of the war for the Soviet Union. After the failed Kharkov operation, German troops of Army Group South rushed towards the Volga and the Caucasus. The Red Army retreated eastward, leaving the enemy vast, rich territories, the breadbasket of the Don and the industrial Donbass. Rostov-on-Don fell, opening the way to Stalingrad and the Caucasus oil fields. The country was on the brink of disaster. The loss of the Caucasus would mean the loss of the main source of fuel for the army and industry, and the fall of Stalingrad would cut off the Volga, the most important transport artery. In this critical, desperate situation, on July 28, 1942, People's Commissar of Defense Joseph Stalin issued an order that went down in history as one of the most brutal and famous documents of the era. Order number 227. It was read out to the troops in all units of the army and began with a mercilessly honest admission of failure. We have lost more than 70 million people, more than 800 million poods of grain per year, and more than 10 million tons of metal per year. To retreat further means to destroy ourselves and, at the same time, to destroy our motherland. The text of the order was extremely harsh and left no room for ambiguity. It noted the decline in discipline and introduced draconian measures to restore it. There were two main innovations. First, the order officially and universally introduced blocking detachments in the armies, 3 to 5 detachments per army, with up to 200 men in each. Their task was clearly stated. In the event of panic and disorderly retreat of division units, shoot the panic-stricken and cowards on the spot. Second, the order introduced penal units. For those guilty of violating discipline due to cowardice or instability, penal companies of up to 800 men were created and sent to the most dangerous sections of the front. Penal battalions were created for middle and senior commanders and political workers. To end up there meant getting a chance to redeem your guilt to the motherland with your blood. Order number 227 was an act of state desperation. It was an attempt to stop the retreat, not with tactical decisions, but with the power of fear, countering fear of the enemy with an even greater fear, of imminent reprisals from their own side. It was directed not only at ordinary soldiers, but also at commanders, demanding that they stand to the death and put an end to retreatist sentiments. This document became the legal and moral basis for a wave of repression in the army. But at the same time, according to many historians, it played a role in ultimately stabilizing the front. The question of whether this cruelty was necessary or criminal remains one of the most painful in the history of the war. After Order number 227 officially introduced the barrier troops, their organization took on a clearer framework. Each army had 3 to 5 barrier detachments, each numbering from 100 to 200 men. The total number of all Red Army barrier troops at the peak of their use was about 30 to 40,000 men. This was a drop in the ocean of a multi-million army, which already casts doubt on the legends of mass shootings of their own. Who served in the barrier troops? Contrary to popular belief, they were not exclusively NKVD officers. The majority were ordinary Red Army soldiers and commanders selected for their reliability, discipline, and political loyalty. Often they were communists and Komsomol members, battle-hardened veterans. Career NKVD officers formed the core of the command of these units, but the rank and file were army personnel. The weapons used by the barrier troops also did not correspond to the images portrayed in films. They did not have heavy Maxim machine guns for firing on entire units. Their main weapons were rifles, PPSH submachine guns, and handheld machine guns. These were weapons for detaining small groups or individuals, not for destroying large formations. The barrier troops were stationed 2 to 3 kilometers behind the front line, on the main roads and trails along which units could retreat. Their main task was formulated in documents as preventing the unauthorized withdrawal of units and subunits from their positions. The actual practice of the barrier detachments was as follows. When retreating soldiers approached, the barrier detachment stopped them and carried out filtration. Soldiers who had lost contact with their units in battle were formed into combined units and sent back to the front. The wounded were sent to medical battalions. Those suspected of desertion or panic were detained for transfer to special departments. The use of weapons was a last resort. According to surviving reports from barrier detachment commanders, fire was opened in cases where groups of armed soldiers refused to obey orders to stop and continued to move toward the rear. Even then, warning shots were fired into the air first. According to archival data, during the period of operation of the barrier troops from August 1942 to October 1944, they detained about 400,000 military personnel. Most of them were returned to their units. About 25,000 were arrested and sent to penal units, and just over 1,000 were shot. These figures are certainly horrifying, but they are far from the tens and hundreds of thousands that are sometimes mentioned. The psychological effect of the barrier troops was perhaps more important than the real one. Every soldier knew that there was a barrier behind him, that escape could result in a court-martial or a penal battalion. This created additional motivation to hold out to the end. At the same time, the barrier detachment system also had negative consequences. It undermined trust between commanders and subordinates and created an atmosphere of fear and suspicion. Many military leaders believed that the barrier troops hindered flexible command and tactical retreats. Nevertheless, in the critical situation of 1942, this system probably played a role in stabilizing the front. Along with the barrier troops, Order Number 227 introduced another cruel instrument of military discipline: penal units. This system, based on the idea of atoning for one's guilt with blood, became one of the darkest pages in the history of the Red Army. Penal units were divided into 2 types: penal companies for ordinary soldiers and junior commanders, and penal battalions for middle and senior commanders, as well as political workers. The difference was fundamental and reflected the hierarchy of military responsibility. A penal company numbered between 150 and 200 men and was attached to a rifle division. A penal battalion, numbering up to 800 men, operated at the army or front level. What were the reasons for being sent to a penal unit? The range of offenses was very wide. These could be disciplinary violations, unauthorized absence, disobeying orders, drunkenness, but most often, People were sent to the penal battalions on charges of cowardice, panic-mongering, instability, or defeatist sentiments. More serious offenses could also land you in a penal battalion, leaving your position without orders, losing a flag, or being taken prisoner in circumstances that the tribunal deemed disgraceful. A special category was made up of commanders whose units had suffered serious losses or defeat. They were often made scapegoats for failures that were the result of objective reasons: enemy superiority, incorrect orders from above, or simply an unfortunate combination of circumstances. Life in penal units was harsh. Penal soldiers were stripped of all military ranks and insignia. Their rations were cut, letters home were strictly censored, and often banned altogether. Most importantly, they were thrown into the most dangerous areas of the front. Storming fortified positions, combat reconnaissance, and breaking through minefields. Penal soldiers were the first to attack, often without artillery preparation, in order to feel out enemy firing points at the cost of their own lives. The penal units were commanded by career officers who were not on trial, but their position was also unenviable. Failure of an operation involving penal soldiers could cost them their careers or even their lives. This created additional motivation to squeeze the maximum out of the penal battalions without sparing their lives. The term of service in penal battalions was theoretically up to 3 months, or until the first injury. In practice, few survived to see this term. The mortality rate in penal battalions and penal companies was 3 to 4 times higher than in regular units. According to some sources, it reached 80 to 90%. To atone for one's guilt with blood literally meant to pay for it with one's life. And yet, among the penal battalions, there were those who managed not only to survive, but also to show genuine heroism. History knows many examples of penal soldiers inspired by the desire to redeem themselves, who performed feats for which they would have received orders and medals in regular units. But for a penal soldier, the highest reward was simply the right to return to a regular unit with a clean reputation. The penal battalion system existed until the end of the war, although their number was significantly reduced after the Battle of Stalingrad, when the strategic initiative passed to the Red Army. In total, about 400,000 people passed through the penal battalions during the war. It was a machine for processing human lives into military successes. Cruel, but, in the opinion of the command, necessary. The wartime military justice system became a veritable conveyor belt of death. Military tribunals, created to maintain discipline in the army, turned into instruments of mass repression, where human life was valued less than demonstrating the inevitability of punishment. In accordance with a directive dated June 27, 1941, military tribunals were given the right to hear cases under a simplified procedure. This meant that hearings could take place without the participation of a defense attorney, without a thorough examination of the circumstances of the case, and that sentences could be carried out immediately without the right to appeal. The procedure was extremely simplified. The indictment, a brief summary of the facts, and the sentence. The entire process could take from a few hours to 1 or 2 days. In practice, a system of troikas developed, consisting of 3 people, usually a representative of the military tribunal, an officer from a special department, and a unit commander, who handed down sentences in batches, several cases a day. The statistics of military tribunal sentences are striking in their cruelty. During the war, military tribunals convicted about 900,000 military personnel. Of these, approximately 100,000 were sentenced to death and shot. Another 200,000 received various terms of imprisonment in gulag camps, and the rest were sent to penal battalions. What were the death sentences for? Formally, they were for crimes defined as war crimes: treason, espionage, sabotage, desertion, and cowardice in the face of the enemy. But in practice, almost any action or even inaction could be classified under these articles. A commander whose unit retreated without orders could be shot for treason. A soldier who lost his weapon in battle could be shot for sabotage. Critical comments about the quality of supplies or command were classified as defeatist agitation. The fate of the senior command was particularly tragic. In the first months of the war, Army General Dmitry Pavlov, commander of the Western Front, and his closest associates were arrested and shot. They were accused of criminal inaction and aiding the enemy, although the disaster on the Western Front was the result of the suddenness of the attack, the technical superiority of the Germans, and the incorrect pre-war strategy. Pavlov became the scapegoat for failures for which the highest political leadership was responsible. Execution by firing squad in front of the troops became one of the methods used to influence the army. The sentence was often carried out in public, in front of the condemned man's comrades. This was intended to demonstrate the inevitability of punishment and intimidate potential breakers of discipline. Sometimes comrades in arms were called upon to carry out the executions. This was a particularly sophisticated way of breaking the will and turning the army into a docile instrument. Military tribunals operated not only in the rear, but also on the front lines. Mobile courts were held directly in dugouts and earthen huts, a few kilometers from the front line. A sentence could be handed down and carried out within 24 hours of arrest. This speed ruled out any possibility of intervention by higher command or review of the case. The tragedy of military justice was that many of those shot were innocent of the charges against them. Posthumous rehabilitations in the post-war period showed that a significant number of sentences were handed down on the basis of false accusations, fabricated facts, or simply denunciations. The system demanded victims, and victims were found. Military tribunals became a machine that ground down not only genuine cowards and traitors, but also ordinary people who found themselves in the extreme conditions of war. While the NKVD fought internal enemies in the ranks of the Red Army at the front, another invisible front was unfolding behind enemy lines: the Partisan War. Here, too, the state security organs played a key role, exercising strict control over the spontaneous popular resistance. From the first days of the war, partisan detachments began to form in the Soviet rear. Some of them were created on the initiative of local party organs and NKVD officers who remained in the occupied territory. Others arose spontaneously from among those surrounded by enemy forces, escaped prisoners of war, and local residents who refused to accept the occupation. However, the spontaneous nature of the partisan movement was unacceptable to the Soviet system of government. On May 30, 1942, the central headquarters of the partisan movement was established at the Supreme Command Headquarters under the leadership of Panteleimon Ponomarenko. At the same time, Front and Republican headquarters were created, but real power over the partisans belonged to the curators from the NKVD. The supply of weapons, ammunition, food, and communications equipment to the partisan detachments was completely controlled by the state security agencies. U-2 aircraft, which dropped supplies to the partisans, flew on orders from the NKVD. Radio communication with the mainland was also carried out through radio stations controlled by agency employees. This made it possible not only to coordinate the actions of the partisans, but also to strictly control their political loyalty. Particular attention was paid to the purity of the ranks of the partisan movement. The NKVD authorities feared the infiltration of false partisans, German agents, Vlasovites, and nationalists into the units. Therefore, every new person wishing to join a unit underwent a thorough check. Often, this check included not only a study of the person's biography, but also practical tests, participation in sabotage, or the elimination of traitors. Partisan detachment commanders were also under constant surveillance. Each large detachment had a commissar or security officer who monitored not only combat activities, but also the political mood of the fighters and commanders. Any manifestation of independence, criticism of the actions of the Soviet command, or doubts about the correctness of party policy were immediately reported upstairs. Particularly tense relations developed between the NKVD and Army intelligence during the organization of sabotage operations behind enemy lines. The 4th Directorate of the NKVD, which specialized in sabotage, and the Intelligence Directorate of the General Staff often acted independently of each other and sometimes in open competition. This led to duplication of efforts, conflicts over spheres of influence, and even mutual suspicions of disloyalty. The repression also affected the partisan movement. Commanders of units who showed excessive independence or suffered military setbacks could be recalled to the rear for reporting and never return. History knows of cases when successful partisan commanders were arrested on charges of ties to the enemy or abuse of authority. For example, the commander of one of the most effective Belarusian partisan units was arrested and shot for allegedly conducting negotiations with the German command on the exchange of prisoners too independently. At the same time, the NKVD created its own special units for operations behind enemy lines. These groups, consisting of professional scouts and saboteurs, carried out particularly important tasks: destroying key facilities, eliminating high-ranking collaborators, and obtaining secret information. They operated independently of the people's partisans and often regarded them as unreliable. Thus, even in guerrilla warfare, seemingly the most popular and spontaneous form of resistance, the NKVD managed to establish its system of control and surveillance. The fight against the enemy was conducted under the watchful eye of the authorities, who were ready at any moment to crack down on those they considered insufficiently loyal or suspicious. By the spring of 1943, when the strategic initiative began to shift to the Red Army, Stalin decided to radically reorganize the military counterintelligence system. On April 19, 1943, a decree was signed establishing the main counterintelligence directorate, SMERSH, of the USSR People's Commissariat of Defense. This abbreviation, which stands for Death to Spies, became one of the most sinister symbols of the Soviet punitive apparatus. The creation of SMERSH meant fundamental changes in the system of control over the army. Special departments of the NKVD, which had previously been engaged in military counterintelligence, were removed from the structure of the People's Commissariat of Internal Affairs and transferred to the direct control of the People's Commissariat of Defense. Formally, this looked like a weakening of the NKVD's influence over the army, but in reality, it was merely a redistribution of power in the upper echelons. Viktor Abakumov, one of the most brutal and unprincipled figures of the Stalin era, was placed at the head of SMERSH. Prior to that, he had headed counterintelligence operations in the NKVD and had established himself as a man willing to use any means necessary to achieve his goals. Abakumov's appointment meant that the new agency would act even more decisively and ruthlessly than its predecessors. Why was this reorganization carried out? Officially, it was to improve the effectiveness of the fight against enemy agents and strengthen security in the armed forces. But the real reasons were deeper. Stalin wanted to weaken the influence of Lavrenti Beria, who controlled military counterintelligence through the NKVD. By transferring this function directly to the People's Commissariat for Defense, the leader gained additional leverage over the army, bypassing his powerful ally. In addition, military successes began to create an aura of glory around some commanders, which aroused suspicion in the paranoid dictator. The SMERSH structure was built on the principle of maximum centralization. The main office in Moscow controlled SMERSH offices on the front lines and in the armies, which in turn directed SMERSH departments in divisions and regiments. At the same time, there were SMERSH departments in the Navy and border troops. The total number of employees reached 50,000 people, an entire army of spy hunters. SMERSH's tasks formally included combating German agents, preventing sabotage and subversion, and maintaining discipline in the troops. But in practice, the agency's activities were much broader. SMERSH employees did everything that the special departments had done before: identifying enemies of the people in the army, checking the loyalty of the command staff, and combating defeatist sentiments. SMERSH's methods were traditional for Soviet punitive bodies, mass arrests, torture during interrogations, show trials, and executions. One of the most cynical areas of activity was the fight against so-called self-shooters, soldiers who allegedly wounded themselves to avoid participating in combat. SMERSH employees developed a whole science of distinguishing real combat wounds from self-inflicted injuries. At the slightest suspicion, a wounded soldier was accused of self-mutilation and handed over to a military tribunal. Many of these accusations were absurd, but the system required the constant identification of new enemies. SMERSH also checked military personnel who had been released from German captivity or had broken out of encirclement. Each such person automatically became suspicious and was subject to thorough screening. Thousands of people who had already gone through the hell of war and captivity ended up in SMERSH camps and prisons on suspicion of collaborating with the enemy. Paradoxically, the creation of SMERSH did indeed increase the effectiveness of military counterintelligence, a clearer management structure, better interaction with military units, and concentration of resources yielded results. Many real enemy agents and sabotage groups were exposed and eliminated, but these successes were achieved at the cost of mass repression against innocent people. SMERSH became the apogee of a system of total distrust and control, where every soldier could at any moment find himself suspected of treason. One of the most tragic and little-known pages of the war was the fate of Soviet soldiers who were captured by the Germans or found themselves surrounded. For the Soviet system, every such person automatically became suspicious, a potential traitor who could be recruited by the enemy. This suspicion led to the creation of a system of filtration camps that was monstrous in its cruelty. The theoretical basis for this attitude toward prisoners of war was Order Number 270 of September 28, 1942, which prescribed a thorough check of all those released from captivity or who had broken out of encirclement. The logic was simple and cruel. If a person had survived German captivity, it meant that he could collaborate with the enemy. If he had broken out of the encirclement, it meant that he could have surrendered military secrets or received enemy orders. The first filtration camps began to be set up as early as 1942, but the system became widespread after the turning point in the war, when the Red Army began to liberate occupied territories and free prisoners of war from German camps. By 1944, there were more than 100 such camps in the USSR, with a total population of up to 500,000 people. The filtration procedure was worked out in detail. Those who arrived at the camp were divided into categories. Officers and political workers were checked especially thoroughly, while ordinary soldiers were checked according to a simplified procedure. Everyone had to write a detailed autobiography, describe how they were captured or surrounded, and explain how they managed to survive and escape. These statements were compared with the data of other prisoners and checked through an agent network. The conditions in the filtration camps were little different from those in ordinary Gulag camps. People lived in barracks, were undernourished, and performed hard physical labor. Medical care was minimal, which was especially cynical towards those who had just returned from German captivity and had already ruined their health. Psychological pressure was constant. Those being checked were forced to write denunciations of each other and seek out traitors among their fellow sufferers. The results of the checks were predictable. About 60% of those checked were sent to regular military units, but with a mark in their personal files that closed the door to promotion or positions of responsibility. About 20% were sent to penal battalions and companies to atone for the shame of captivity with their blood. The remaining 20% were sentenced to terms in Gulag camps, and the most vicious were shot on charges of treason. The system was particularly cruel to officers. It was believed that a commander had no right to be taken prisoner under any circumstances. He must either die in battle or shoot himself. Therefore, most officers who had been captured by the Germans were automatically classified as traitors. Many of them, having survived the horrors of the concentration camps, died in Soviet camps or were shot as enemies of the people. The absurdity of the system was evident in the fact that even heroes who had escaped from captivity participated in the partisan movement or helped other prisoners were suspected. Heroism was no protection against accusations. On the contrary, overly heroic behavior could be interpreted as an attempt to hide treason or as the fulfillment of an enemy mission to infiltrate Soviet authorities. The tragedy was compounded by the fact that many of those who ended up in filtration camps were not prisoners of war in the full sense of the word. They were civilians kidnapped by the Germans for forced labor in Germany, partisans, underground fighters, and Soviet citizens who found themselves in occupied territory. But to the system, they were all equally suspicious. The filtration camps existed until 1947. A total of about 4 million people passed through them. This figure speaks to the scale of the tragedy. Millions of people who had already survived the horrors of war and occupation were subjected to additional repression by their own state. The filtration camp system was the culmination of the state's distrust of its own citizens, when victims became suspects and suffering became evidence against the sufferers themselves. As the Red Army began to liberate the occupied territories, it was followed by special NKVD units, whose task was to restore Soviet order. This phrase concealed large-scale repressive operations against the local population, which had lived under a German occupation for 2 or 3 years. For the Soviet system, every inhabitant of the liberated territories was potentially infected with anti-Soviet sentiments and required purification. The first task of the NKVD operational groups in the liberated territories was to purge undesirable elements. This category included anyone who had collaborated with the occupation authorities in any way: police officers, village elders, translators, and employees of German institutions. However, the criteria for collaboration were interpreted very broadly. A person could be arrested for working at a German enterprise, even though the alternative was death by starvation, for keeping his shop or workshop open under the Germans, or even for not joining the partisans when he had the opportunity to do so. Purges were carried out according to pre-compiled lists, but often took on a spontaneous character. A neighbor's denunciation or the personal animosity of an NKVD officer was enough for a person to disappear forever. The families of those arrested were also subjected to repression, eviction, deprivation of property, and exile. The children of traitors were expelled from schools and deprived of their right to education. A special focus was placed on the fight against national minorities, whom the Soviet authorities suspected of mass collaboration with the Germans. The fate of the peoples of the North Caucasus and Crimea was the most tragic. In February 1944, the deportation of Chechens and Ingush began. Within a few days, hundreds of thousands of people were herded into freight cars and sent to Kazakhstan and Central Asia. The official pretext was mass collaboration with the German invaders, but in reality, it was a premeditated ethnic cleansing. The operation was carried out with the cruelty characteristic of the NKVD. People were not warned in advance, were given only minutes to pack, and families were separated. Those who could not move, the sick, the elderly, and infants, were often simply left to die. Tens of thousands of people died on the way from cold, disease, and hunger. A similar fate befell the Balkars, Karachis, and Kalmyks. In May 1944, the deportation of the Crimean Tatars took place. The entire operation took 3 days, during which more than 180,000 people were evicted. Crimean Tatar villages and towns were emptied. Mosques were blown up or turned into warehouses, and the very name of the people was erased from official documents. The deportations were accompanied by large-scale looting. The property of those deported was declared confiscated by the state, but in reality, it was stolen by NKVD officers, party officials, and local residents. Houses, livestock, crops, personal belongings, everything was sold off or simply looted. In the liberated territories, pre-war mechanisms of repression were also restored. NKVD troikas, special meetings, and a system of informants. The local population was intimidated by mass arrests and executions. An atmosphere of universal fear was created, where everyone was afraid of everyone else, and any careless word could cost you your life. Special attention was paid to young people. Young men and women who had lived under occupation during their formative years were considered particularly susceptible to enemy influence. They were expelled from the Komsomol en masse, denied admission to universities, and barred from positions of responsibility. Many were sent to remote areas of the USSR for re-education. The restoration of Soviet power in the liberated territories was carried out exclusively through coercion and terror. No one was interested in what people had gone through during the years of occupation, how they had survived in inhuman conditions, or at what cost they had saved their lives and those of their children. The state saw them only as potential enemies who had to be either destroyed or intimidated into complete submission. This policy poisoned relations between the authorities and the population of the liberated territories for a long time, and created deep traumas that were passed down from generation to generation. Behind countless orders, directives, and statistical reports were real people. Those who carried out these orders and those who became their victims. The human factor in the history of the NKVD's wartime punitive machine remains one of the most complex and painful issues. Who were the people who served in the state security agencies at the front? The popular image is that of a fanatical sadist in a leather coat who derives pleasure from the suffering of others. The reality was much more complex. Most of the employees of the special departments and SMERSH were ordinary people of their time, raised in an atmosphere of class struggle and the belief that the end justified the means. For many of them, working in the security services was a way to climb the social ladder, an opportunity to escape poverty and gain status. Others ended up there through conscription or mobilization and carried out their duties as a military obligation. Still others sincerely believed that they were defending their homeland from internal enemies. Psychological studies show how ordinary people can become participants in mass repression. Mechanisms of de-individualization, blurring of responsibility, and gradual habituation to violence turned yesterday's peasants and workers into executioners. The system was structured so that everyone was responsible only for their own small area of work. One compiled a list of suspects, another carried out the arrest, a third conducted the investigation, and a fourth carried out the sentence. No one was responsible for the overall result. Ideological indoctrination played an important role. NKVD employees were convinced that they were waging a holy war against enemies of the people, that pity for traitors was treason against the motherland. An image of an internal enemy was created, even more dangerous than the external enemy, because he hid behind the mask of a Soviet patriot. In this system of coordinates, shooting a panic monger or sending a former prisoner of war to the Gulag seemed like acts of state wisdom. Of course, there were those who openly enjoyed power over life and death. The system attracted outright sadists, careerists, and people with disturbed psyches. Impunity corrupted, and absolute power over defenseless people awakened the darkest instincts. Some investigators and operatives truly became sophisticated torturers, inventing ever new ways to break the will of those under investigation. But there were others, those who tried to preserve their humanity in inhuman conditions. History has preserved many examples of law enforcement officers helping innocent people, warning them of arrests, and falsifying documents in favor of the accused. Of course, this required enormous courage because exposure meant certain death, but such people existed. The victims of the system were a wide variety of people. Career military personnel suspected of military specialist sentiments. Political workers who did not perform their duties zealously enough. Ordinary soldiers who showed instability at a critical moment. Civilians in liberated territories suspected of collaborating with the occupiers. Entire peoples declared collectively guilty of treason. The victims' reactions to the repression varied. Some broke down immediately, ready to sign any charges and incriminate anyone, just to stop the torture. Others held out to the end, preferring death to the shame of a false confession. Still others tried to adapt, to find a way to survive in inhuman conditions while preserving at least a shred of human dignity. A special category is those who turned suffering into spiritual strength, who managed not only to preserve, but also to deepen their humanity in camp barracks and prison cells. There were also true heroes, people who consciously went to their deaths, refusing to betray their comrades or renounce their beliefs. In most cases, their names remain unknown, but their feat is no less great than that of the soldiers who died on the battlefields. They fought to preserve human dignity in conditions where the very concept of dignity was declared a prejudice. The human factor in the history of the NKVD's punitive machine shows that even in the most inhumane systems, there is still room for moral choice. And the choice made by each individual determines not only their own fate, but also the degree of evil that the system as a whole can inflict. By the end of 1943, after the victories at Stalingrad and the Battle of Kursk, the strategic situation at the front had changed dramatically. The Red Army had finally seized the initiative and launched a relentless offensive to the west. These changes could not fail to affect the role and methods of the punitive organs in the army. The control apparatus, created during a period of mortal danger, began to slowly but inevitably transform. The first changes affected the institution of military commissars. On October 9, 1942, riding the wave of euphoria from the successes at Stalingrad, a decree was issued abolishing dual power in the army and restoring a single chain of command. Commissars were transformed into deputy commanders for political affairs, or Zampolits. Formally, this looked like a technical reorganization, but in fact it meant the recognition of the failure of the system of total distrust of the command structure. The experience of war had shown that dual power hindered the effective management of troops, and commanders who had gone through the crucible of battle had proven their loyalty with blood, not words. The political officers retained their functions of political education and control, but lost their right to veto the commander's decisions. This was the first step toward dismantling a system based on mutual distrust. The next important milestone was the gradual reduction of the barrier troops. On October 15, 1944, when the Red Army was already fighting in East Prussia and Poland, an order was issued to disband the barrier troops in the armies. The official reason was due to the increased resilience of the troops and the improvement in the morale and political state of the personnel. Behind these bureaucratic phrases lay the recognition that the fear of being shot in the back was no longer necessary to maintain discipline. The troops, having tasted victory, now fought not out of fear, but out of an inner conviction that their cause was just. In addition, in the final stage of the war, the army needed every soldier on the front lines, and maintaining tens of thousands of men in barrier units became an unaffordable luxury. Their personnel were transferred to regular rifle units, where the former panic hunters became ordinary soldiers. The penal battalion system remained in place until the very end of the war. But even here, there were significant changes. While in the critical period of 1942 to 1943, penal battalions were used as cannon fodder for the most hopeless operations. By 1944 to 1945, they began to be used more rationally. Penal battalions and companies still performed difficult tasks, but the command no longer regarded their lives as expendable. The value of combat experience began to exceed the value of intimidation. The evolution also affected the activities of SMERSH. With the transition of combat operations to enemy territory, the main task of military counterintelligence became not the fight against internal enemies, but working with the local population, identifying Nazi functionaries, and preventing sabotage. In the rear of the advancing troops, SMERSH increasingly transformed from a punitive body into an intelligence and analytical service. The attitude toward prisoners of war and those surrounded by enemy forces also changed. Although the system of filtration camps continued to function, the procedures became less cruel. The army was in dire need of reinforcements, and every vetted soldier who returned to the ranks was worth his weight in gold. Mass executions for being in captivity ceased, although the system remained suspicious of such people. The psychological atmosphere in the troops also gradually changed. Soldiers and officers who saw their army crushing the once invincible Wehrmacht and advancing on Berlin gained confidence in themselves and their abilities. The fear of defeat, which had been the basis for the functioning of the control machine, was replaced by a sense of anticipation of victory. In such conditions, methods of intimidation lost their effectiveness and even became counterproductive. The final dismantling of the wartime system began after Germany's surrender. In July 1945, the penal units were disbanded and their personnel transferred to regular military units with full restoration of their rights. SMERSH was transformed into the main counterintelligence directorate of the MGB, losing its specifically military functions. The filtration camps continued to operate until 1947, but now as part of the general Gulag system rather than as an emergency military measure. Thus, the system of total control and repression in the army, created during the critical months of 1941 to 1942, lasted for about 3 years. Its dismantling was gradual and cautious. Stalin did not want sudden changes that could destabilize the situation. But the logic of war proved stronger than the logic of repression. The victorious army no longer needed a machine of fear to maintain morale. The history of the NKVD's punitive system on the front lines of the Great Patriotic War became one of the most hushed-up topics in Soviet historiography for many decades. The official version of events, formed under Stalin and preserved until the end of the 1980s, presented the participation of the state security organs in the war in an exclusively heroic light. Selfless struggle against enemy agents, exposure of traitors, and strengthening of the rear. The barrier troops, mass repression in the army, penal battalions, and filtration camps were either not mentioned at all or referred to in passing as necessary wartime measures. Soviet literature and cinema created a romanticized image of the Chekist at war. In films and books, members of special departments and SMERSH were portrayed as noble fighters for justice who risked their lives to expose spies and saboteurs. The images of Major Vikri from The Feet of a Scout and Captain Alyokin from The Shield and the Sword became classics. These characters, intelligent, courageous, and impeccably honest, shaped the mass consciousness's idea of what the authorities were supposedly doing at the front. The real activities of the barrier troops, if mentioned at all, were presented in a very limited way. In the memoirs of military leaders, phrases such as measures to strengthen discipline or the fight against panic mongers occasionally slipped through, but the details were carefully concealed. The subject of penal units was slightly more open. They were sometimes described as an opportunity to redeem one's guilt with blood, but the scale of their use and the conditions of service in them were concealed. The turning point came during the years of perestroika, and especially after the collapse of the USSR, when previously secret archives began to be opened. Historians gained access to documents from the NKVD, SMERSH, and military tribunals. Memoirs and testimonies of those who had been through penal battalions, barrier detachments, and filtration camps began to be published. The picture that emerged was radically different from the official version. The true scale of repression in the army became known. Hundreds of thousands were shot, millions went through the filtration system, and tens of thousands died in penal battalions. The publication of these facts sparked heated debate in society. Some historians and publicists saw the NKVD's activities as a crime against its own people, comparable to the crimes of the Nazis. They argued that the system of barrier troops and penal battalions did not strengthen the country's defense capabilities, but undermined them, turning the war into a fratricidal slaughter. In their opinion, victory was achieved not thanks to, but in spite of the actions of the punitive organs. Another point of view, defended mainly by military historians of the old school, was that in conditions of mortal danger, all means were good for saving the fatherland. They pointed to the catastrophic situation in the summer of 1942, when the enemy was approaching the Volga and the Caucasus, and argued that only harsh measures made it possible to stop the panic and stabilize the front. From this point of view, the NKVD played an important, albeit unsavory, role in achieving victory. Contemporary Russian historians are trying to find a more balanced approach to assessing this issue. Most of them acknowledge that the scale of repression in the army was excessive and often unjustified, and that many innocent people suffered. At the same time, they note that it would be wrong to completely deny the effectiveness of harsh disciplinary measures in critical situations. The truth, as usual, lies somewhere in between. Discussions about the role of the NKVD at the front go far beyond academic debates. They touch on fundamental questions about the price of victory. whether great goals justify cruel means, and the limits of state coercion, even in extreme circumstances. In modern Russia, this topic remains painful and politicized. The official position strives for balance. It acknowledges that repression took place, but emphasizes its necessary nature and ultimate goal of achieving victory. Critics of this position see it as an attempt to justify the unjustifiable. The memory of the NKVD's punitive system during the war has become part of a broader problem of historical memory about Stalin's repressions. For some, it is a symbol of the extremes to which a state can go when it puts ideology above human life. For others, it is evidence that at critical moments in history, society has to pay a terrible price for survival. Perhaps the main lesson of this story is that a system based on fear and mistrust, even if it is capable of mobilizing people for a short time, inevitably corrodes society from within. Victory in the Great Patriotic War was achieved not thanks to the machinery of repression, but in spite of it, through the courage and self-sacrifice of ordinary people who managed to overcome both the external enemy and internal terror. And the memory of this should serve as a warning to future generations that no goals, even the most noble, can justify turning the state into a machine for the destruction of its own citizens.